about modeling the energy and mass coupling of the chromosphere and corona.
Well, thank you. And I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, very nice and clear.
So it's a very general title. It's almost like the title of the session. I will focus mostly on problems of modeling the energy and mass coupling. So I start with the physics, and this is a picture from one of the simulations with the Bifrost code that I will come back to. And these simulations, they aim at including both the driving in the convection zone, only the upper part of the convection zone, unfortunately, but from the convection zone through the photosphere, chromosphere, and all the way up to the corona. So what do we then have to include? Well, in the corona, of course, we have to include conduction as a very important mechanism, as we heard also from Patrick. In the chromosphere, the lines that do dominate the energy balance are not formed in a local thermodynamic equilibrium, and they're not optically thin. So we have the problems of non-LTE. Ionization and recombination timescales are long, especially in the chromosphere, but also in the corona. So we need to include non-equilibrium ionization. Of course, we want to treat shocks to look at the heating of shocks especially the lower chromosphere. We have magnetic fields. We've seen that the magnetic fields will be responsible for the heating in the upper parts of the chromosphere and the corona. Ions and neutrals do not have enough collisional frequency to ensure that they are completely coupled. So that might be also something that we have to take into account. And we have been we've heard and we'll hear more about particles, that we have electron beams that come from reconnection, and that will introduce even more complicated physics. So can we do this? Well, in one dimension or field aligned, where we look at that all the processes are actually governed by the magnetic field in the upper part of the chromosphere and the corona, then we can do it. And there are codes like Radin and Flarix with the full treatment of the non-LTE of the major species, and Hydrad with a more emphasis on the non-equilibrium ionization of very many species. But it's field aligned, and the driving, you don't have convection, you don't have the motion of the field lines, so you have to have a prescribed driving or prescribed electron beams, and we'll hear a little bit about that in the next talk by Paula. What about then to do this in full 3D? Well, brute force, if we use the same methods as we have in Radin and include all the elements, then it would take 6 million years on 5,000 cores for just 1 hour of solar time. So it's very clear that we cannot use the same methods. We cannot use brute force. So we need some smart approximations, and we need to go through and find out which processes we can neglect and how we can approximate some of these processes. We have tried to do that in the code Bifrost, developed in Oslo. And the classical, many of the simulations we have, they are restricted to only a small box, in the star, in the sun. So 24 megameters for this particular simulation, 24 by 24 megameters horizontally with periodic boundary conditions, and going down 2.5 megameters into the convection zone and 14.5 megameters up into the corona. And this is from a simulation where all the simulation results were made publicly available through the IRIS project and in the European Science Data Center in Oslo. So I'll say a few words about that. So you can see that we have two main polarities of magnetic field. They're about 8 megameters apart. So with such a small box, we can have a rather high resolution, but we're limited to a very small magnetic field configuration. And the magnetic field configuration is the main free parameter here. We don't have a prescribed driving. It's driven by the convection or everything that's happening here. But the magnetic field configuration that we start with is a free parameter. We call this enhanced network simulation. This is a top view, and we here see a volume visualization of plasma at a given temperature, and you have that in the upper right corner, 5,000 Kelvin in this case, and log T of 3.7. So we see that the sort of lower chromospheric material is a bit oriented along something that can look like loops. And if we go up in temperature, this becomes more and more clear. So these are sort of start of the low-lying loops that also constitute the unresolved fine structure. At higher temperatures, this is now 6,000, 8,000. And when we go up, so they have about the same topology and they live for not very long, up to we get to about 100,000 Kelvin. And then we see a new, now we start to see a new kind of loop, the hotter loops that are above 100,000 Kelvin that connect these two main polarities. And we have now 500,000 and going up. And when we get to the highest temperatures that in this simulation are about 2 million Kelvin, they are lower down when where the magnetic field is stronger and where we have strong currents. If we see this from the side, we can see that this is now at 10,000 Kelvin, and we see that these loops do not live for very long. They're very dynamic. We have some global oscillations, and there we have even a sort of a mass ejection. So these simulations can be used to study all these processes, but they're really very full of features. So it takes a long time to explore them to the full extent. But one thing that we can do, of course, and we should ask ourselves is, do these simulations really reproduce the observations that we have? And IRIS is a good instrument or good satellite with observations where we can compare with the simulations. And the upper three panels, we have observations from IRIS with a slit jaw image in silicon-4 to the right. In the middle upper panel, we have magnesium-2 and carbon-2 to the left. And the lower three panels, we have the corresponding ones with the same color lookup table from the simulations. And we can immediately see that, well, the simulations cover only a small area of 24 by 24 megameters, but there is some resemblance to what we see in the observations, but the lines are typically too narrow. And if we compare now the average line from the simulation in green here from this enhanced network with the IRIS quiet sun average, the dotted line, we see that the peak intensity is similar, but it's much too narrow. And here is a histogram, the intensity green to the left. We see that it covers what we have in the quiet sun IRIS observations in a solid red. But the peak separation is the thing that is really not very well reproduced. And of course, that gives us a lot of information. These lines, magnesium and carbon lines, are optically thick. So it's really the source function. We could be also the unresolved turbulence in the model, but we have other observations from optically thin lines indicating that that's not the major factor. So we need a flatter temperature structure, more heating low down than we have in the model. We need more chromospheric material. Maybe that's due to the lack of numerical resolution. That's something we're exploring. Could be ion neutral effects, or it could be just because we have put in the magnetic field and we don't have the history of it going through the atmosphere and carrying mass with it. We have then other simulations where this is from a simulation by Rico Hanstein, published in 2019, where a flux sheet was introduced at a lower boundary in a similar box of 24 by 24 megameters and a similar pre-existing magnetic field. And then we get an interaction between the flux sheet that is going through and being fragmented through the convection zone and the pre-existing field, giving rise to reconnection at various heights. In the photosphere, we get something that looks like element bombs. And in the chromosphere, if we get a reconnection there, it looks more like the UV bursts seen by IRIS. And this is now a visualization of the simulation where we put all the boxes, since it's periodic. It looks periodic here as well, but we put them on a sphere and then ray trace, and we can see these flames that are what we can also see in element bomb observations.
5 minutes left.
Then we have the physics. I talked about particles. This is from a paper 2020 by Lars Frogner, where he takes the Bifrost simulation and then where we have the energy dissipation, the dissipation of the magnetic field energy is then put first. He finds out where you have topology changes and puts the energy release into particles and then follow the particles along field lines. And here we have 3 such bundles where the blue is where they're accelerated and the red where they're dissipated. So this is an attempt to sort of a cheap, or it's not that cheap, but I mean, it's doable to follow what's happening if you don't dissipate the energy with the Joule dissipation as normally in the Bifrost simulation, but really put it into particles. So that is very exciting development that has just started. And just as a teaser at the end, we want to have bigger boxes, and that is quite complicated, but we're getting there. So this is from an ongoing simulation by Vigo, which is 72 by 72 megameters, going down 8.5 megameters below the photosphere and 52 megameters above, with the flux emergence going into it. And then we can really start looking at coronal features and compare with SDO observations. And this is just some synthetic observables from that ongoing simulation in silicon 4, iron 9, 12, and iron 15. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Absolutely fascinating results, Professor Carlsson. We have 2 questions for you. One is asked by Jason Durr. So the question is this: if one makes a code with particle injections to an MHD background, how is self-consistency maintained?
Well, it's not. So, I mean, we are going in that direction as well, where we're having another code framework called Dispatch, where we can actually switch the solver. So where we have things happening, we can switch to a kinetic description and particle in cell description where we want to have that. And then you can ensure more consistency, even though you have a lot of problems in going from MHD description to the particle in cell description in the boundaries. But
indeed. We have another question here by Vishal Upendran. Mats, a quick clarification. Are these particles taken as tracer particles, or do you perform a particle in cell kind of simulation?
They are, the particles are sort of followed, I mean, they follow the field lines through just a sort of a tracing, and then they interact with the matter through a approximate Emsley and Hawley-Fisher type approximation. So we find out where they then dump their energy. So they get their energy from what we get a dissipation from the Bifrost, and it's taken away from the local thermal heating and put into particles that are then described with the Emsley Hawley-Fisher formula.
Great. Another question from Manolis Georgoulis. Wonderful talk, Mats. What simulated height do you observe? Do you observe what looks like okay, in what simulated height that you observe these Zellerman bombs happening?
We see them at a few hundred kilometers in the upper photosphere.
Okay, which is consistent with observation and inferences, I take.
I mean, if they happen, if the reconnection happens higher up, then because of the lower densities, you get a very different thermal evolution and also observational signature.
And a last quick question: how does the Bifrost, by Eric Buchling, how does the Bifrost DM at transition region temperature compare with observed DM? I'm asking because of the transition region thickness. That's tough.
Well, we have the work by Thomas Golding, where he also looked both at hydrogen and helium non-equilibrium ionization, and there it looks pretty much like the observed one.
Got it. Okay, great. Thank you so much again.